Hi everyone, welcome in, settle down, snuggle up, get warm, get hydrated. So this is a part of a series on post-colonial feminist reading where I will read to you. So if you have always wanted to learn and understand more about how to understand feminism, practice feminism from an international and intersectional lens, we, in this series, will be going through authors who are kind of essential readings in this area. And we are starting with really what would be considered a quintessential or foundational author in the field, who's Chandra Mohanty. Currently works for the Centre for Feminist Foreign Policy, but is from Mumbai and now lives in America, and wrote one of the foundational texts which we're looking at now, Under Western Eyes, Feminist Scholarship and Colonial Discourses. This is published in Boundary 2, Volume 12, Number 3, on Humanism and the University, The Discourse of Humanism, from 1984. And it's published by Duke University Press. That's who publishes the journal. Okay. It ought to be of some political significance, at least, that the term colonization has come to denote a variety of phenomena in recent feminist and left writings in general. From its analytical value as a category of exploitative economic exchange in traditional and contemporary Marxisms, particularly contemporary, then, feminists, theorists such as Baran, Amin, and Gunda Frank, to its use by feminist women of colour in the US to describe the appropriation of their experiences and struggles by hegemonic white women's movements. Colonization has been used to characterise everything from the most evident economic and political hierarchies to the production of a particularly cultural discourse about what is called the Third World. However sophisticated or problematic it is used as an explanatory construct, colonization almost invariably implies a relation of structural domination and suppression, often violent, of the heterogeneity of the subjects in question. What I wish to analyse is specifically the production of the Third World woman as a singular, monolithic subject in some recent Western feminist texts. The definition of colonization I wish to invoke here is predominantly a discursive one, focusing on a certain mode of appropriation and codification of scholarship and knowledge about women in the Third World by particular analytical categories employed in specific writings on the subject, which take as their referent feminist interests as they are articulated in the US and Western Europe. My concerns about such writings derives from my own implication and investment in contemporary debates and feminist theory, and the urgent political necessity, especially in the age of Reagan, of forming strategic coalitions across class, race, and national boundaries. Clearly, Western feminist discourse and political practice is neither singular nor homogeneous in its goals, interest, or analysis. However, it is possible to trace a coherence of effects, resulting from the implicit assumption of the West, with all of its complexities and contradictions, as the primary referent in theory and praxis. My reference to Western feminism is by no means intended to imply that it is a monolith. Rather, I am attempting to draw attention to the similar effects of various textual strategies used by particular writers that codify others as non-Western, and hence themselves as implicitly Western. It is in this sense that I use the term Western feminist. The analytical principles discussed below serve to distort Western feminist political practices and limit the possibility of coalitions amongst white Western feminists and working class and feminists of colour around the world. These limitations are evident in the construct of the implicitly consensual priority of issues around which apparently all women are expected to organise. The necessary and integral connection between feminist scholarship and feminist political practice and organising determines the significance and status of Western feminist writings on women in the Third World. For feminist scholarship, like other scholarship, is not just the production of knowledge of a subject. It is a directly political and discursive practice in that it is purposeful and ideological. It is best seen as a mode of intervention into a particularly hegemonic discourse. For example, traditional anthropology, sociology, literary criticism. It is a political practice which counters and resists the totalizing imperative of the legitimate and scientific bodies of knowledge. Thus, feminist scholarship practices, whether reading, writing, critical, or textual, are inscribed in relations of power, relations which they can counter, resist, or perhaps implicitly support. There can, of course, be no apolitical scholarship. The relationship between women, a cultural and ideological composite other constructed through diverse representations of discourse, be scientific, literary, judicial, linguistic, cinematic, and women, real, material subjects of their collective histories, is one of the central questions the practice of feminist scholarship seeks to address. This connection between women as historical subjects and the representation of women produced by hegemonic, so normative, discourses is not a relation of direct identity or a relation of correspondence or simple implication. It is an arbitrary relation set up by particular cultures. I would like to suggest that the feminist writings I analyse here discursively colonize the material and historical heterogeneities of the lives of the Third World, thereby producing and representing a composite singular Third World woman, which I personally think still exists to this day. An image which appears arbitrarily constructed, but nevertheless carries with it the authorizing signature of Western humanist discourse. I argue that assumptions of privilege, an ethnocentric universality on the one hand, and inadequate self-consciousness about the effects of Western scholarship on the Third World, in the context of a world system dominated by the West, on the other, characterize a sizable extent of Western feminist work on women in the Third World. An analysis of sexual difference in the form of a cross-cultural singular, monolithic notion of patriarchy, or male dominance, leads to the construction of a similarly reductive and homogeneous notion of what I call the Third World difference, a stable, ahistorical something that apparently oppresses most, if not all, women in these countries. And it is this production of the Third World difference that Western feminists appropriate and colonize the fundamental complexities and conflicts which characterizes the lives of women of different classes, religions, cultures, races, and castes in these countries. I personally would also add ethnicities and sexualities and genders to that. It is this process of homogenization and systemization of the oppression of women in the Third World that power is exercised in much of recent Western feminist discourse, and that this power needs to be defined and named. In the context of the West's hegemonic position today, of what Ano Abel Malek calls the struggle for control over the orientation, regulation, and decision of the process of the world's development on the base of the advanced sector's monopoly of scientific knowledge and on the ideal creativity, Western feminist scholarship on the Third World must be seen and examined precisely in terms of its inscriptions in a particular relation of power and struggle. There is, I shall argue, no universal patriarchal framework which this scholarship attempts to counter and resist, unless one posits an internal male conspiracy or a monolithic ahistorical power hierarchy. There is, however, a particular world balance of power, within which any analysis of culture, ideology, and socio-economic conditions has to be necessarily situated. Abdel Malek is useful here again in reminding us about the inherence of politics in the discourses of culture. And this is a quote. Contemporary imperialism is, in a real sense, a hegemonic imperialism, exercising to a maximum degree a rationalized violence that's taken to a higher level than ever before, through fire and sword, but also through an attempt to control hearts and minds. For its content is defined by the combined action of the military-industrial complex and the hegemonic cultural centers of the West, all of them founded on the advanced levels of development attained by monopoly and finance capital, and supported through the benefits of the scientific and technological revolution and the second industrial revolution itself. Western feminist scholarship cannot avoid the challenge of situating itself and examining its role in such a global economic and political framework. To do any less would be to ignore the complex interconnections between first and third world economies and the profound effects these have on the lives of women in the third world. I also do not question the existence of excellent work which does not fall into the analytical traps I'm concerned with. In fact, I deal with an example later on, in the context of an overwhelming silence about the experiences of women in these countries, as well as the need to forge international links between women's political struggles. Such work is path-breaking and absolutely essential. However, it is both the explanatory potential of particular analytical strategies employed by writing and their political effect in the context of the hegemony of Western scholarship that I want to draw attention here. Whilst feminist writing in the US is still marginalized, except from the point of view of women of color addressing privileged white women, Western feminist writing on women in the third world must be considered in the context of the global hegemony of Western scholarship. The production, the publication, the distribution, and the consumption of information and ideas. Marginal or not, this writing has political effects and implications beyond the immediate feminist or disciplinary audience. One such significant effect of the dominant representations of Western feminism is its conflation with imperialism in the eyes of particular third world women. Hence, the urgent need to examine the political implications of analytical strategies and principles. Excuse me. My critique is directed at three basic analytical principles which are present in Western feminist discourse on women from the Third World. I focus primarily on Zed Press's Women in the Third World series. My comments on Western feminist discourse are circumscribed by my analysis of text from this series. This is a way of limiting and focusing my critique. However, even though I am dealing with feminists who identify themselves as culturally or geographically from the West, what I say about these analytical strategies or principles holds for anyone who uses these methods, whether third world women in the West or third world women in the third world, writing on these issues and publishing in the West. I am not making a culturalist argument about ethnocentrism. Rather, I am trying to uncover how ethnocentric universalism is produced in certain analyses and how, in the context of a hegemonic first, third world connection, it is not very surprising to discover where the ethnocentrism derives from. As a matter of fact, my argument holds for any...
No one seems to know this, but Amazon
For
actually
gosh
has
sake. Bloody adverts. Where was I? As a matter of fact, my argument holds for any discourse that sets up its own authorial subjects as the implicit referent, i.e. yardstick, to which to encode and represent cultural others. It is in this move that power is exercised in discourse. The first principle I focus on concerns the strategic location or the category of women vis-à-vis the context of analysis. The assumption of women as a constituted coherent group with identical interests and desires, regardless of class, ethnic or racial location, implies a notion of gender or sexual difference or even patriarchy, as male dominance, men as a correspondingly coherent group, which can be applied universally and cross-culturally. The context of analysis can be anything from kinship structures and the organization of labor to media representations. The second principle consists of the uncritical use of the particular methodologies in providing proof of universality and cross-cultural validity. The third is a more specifically political principle underlying the methodologies and analytical strategies, the model of power and the struggle that they imply and suggest. I argue that as a result of the two modes or frames of analysis described above, a homogeneous notion of the oppression of women as a group is assumed, which in turn produces the image of an average third world woman, which, to be clear, doesn't exist. This average third world woman leads an essentially truncated life based on her feminine gender and being third world, which is seen as ignorant, poor, uneducated, tradition-bound, domestic, family-orientated, victimized. This is to suggest, in contrast to the implicit self-representation of women as educated and modern, having control over their own bodies and sexualities and the freedom to make their own decisions. The distinction between feminist representation of women in the third world and Western feminist self-presentation is a distinction of the same order as that made by Marxists between the maintenance and production of housewife and the real productive role of wage labour, or the characterization of the developmentist third world as engaged in a lesser production of raw materials in contrast to the real productive activity of the first world. These distinctions are made on the basis of the privilege of the particular group as the norm or referent. Men involved in wage labour, first world producers, and I suggest Western feminists, who sometimes cast third world women in terms of ourselves undressed, all construct themselves as a referent in the binary analytic. This is just white feminism, white liberal feminism, and she's about to smash it up. Women as a category, or we are all sisters in struggle. By women as a category of analysis, I'm referring to the critical assumption that all of us of the same gender amongst class are somehow socially constructed as a homogeneous group, identified a priori, to the process of analysis. This is an assumption which characterizes much feminist discourse. The homogeneity of women as a group is produced not on the basis of biological essentials, but rather on the basis of secondary sociological and anthropological universals. Thus, for instance, in a particular given piece of feminist analysis, women are characterized as a singular group on the basis of shared oppression. What binds women together is a sociological notion of the sameness of their oppression. It is, at this point, what an Ellison takes place between women as a discursive constructed group and women as material subjects of their own history. Thus, the discursively consensual homogeneity of women as a group is mistaken for the historically specific material reality of groups of women. This results in an assumption of women as a always constituted group, which one is labelled as powerless, exploited, and sexually harassed by feminist scientific, economic, legal, and sociological discourses. Notice that it is quite similar to sexist discourse, labelling women weak, emotional, having math anxiety, etc. The focus is not on uncovering the material and ideological specifics that constitute a particular group of women as powerless in a context. It is rather on finding a variety of powerlessness groups of women to prove the general point that all women are powerless. In this section, I focus on 5 specific ways in which women, as a category of analysis in Western discourse of the Third World, is used. Each of these illustrates the construct of Third World women as a homogeneous, powerless group, often located as implicit victims of a particular socio-economic system. I have chosen to deal with a variety of writers, from Fran Hosken, who writes about FGM, and writers about women in the International Development School, who write about the effect of development policies on Third World women for Western and Third World audiences. The similarity of assumptions about Third World women in all of these texts forms the basis of my discussion. This is not to equate all the texts that I analyse, nor equalise their strengths and weaknesses. The authors I deal with write with varying degrees of care and complexities. However, the effect of the representation of Third World women in these texts is a coherent one, due to the use of women as a homogeneous category of analysis. And it is this effect that I focus on. In these texts, women are defined as victims of male violence, victims of the Arab familial system, victims of economic development, and finally, victims of the Islamic code. This mode of defining women in terms of their object status, the way in which they're affected or not affected by certain institutions and systems, is what characterises this particular form of the use of women as a category of analysis. In the context of Western women writing, studying women in the Third World, such objectification needs to be named and challenged. As Amos and Palmer argue quite eloquently in a recent essay, feminist theories which examine our cultural practices as feudal residues or label us as traditional also portray us as politically immature women who need to be versed and schooled in the ethos of Western feminism. They need to be continually challenged. Women as victims of male violence. Fran Hosken, in writing about the relationship between human rights and FGM in Africa and the Middle East, bases her discussion and condemnation of FGM as one of privileged premise. The goal of genital mutilation is to mutilate the sexual pleasures and satisfaction of women. This in turn leads her to claim that women's sexuality is controlled, as is their reproductive potential. According to Hosken, male sexual politics in Africa and around the world share the same political goal: to assure female dependence and subservience by any means. Physical violence against women, essay excision, infibulation is carried out with astonishing consensus amongst men. Here, women are defined consistently as the victims of male control and the sexually oppressed. Although that is true that the potential of male violence against women circumscribes and elucidates the social position, defining women as archetypal victims freezes them into objects who defend themselves, men into subjects who perpetuate violence, and every society into powerless and powerful groups of people. Male violence must be theorized and interpreted within specific societies, and preferably by people from those societies, both in order to understand it as well as in order to effectively organize to change it. Sisterhood cannot be assumed on the basis of gender. It must be forged in concrete, historical, and political practices and analysis. Damn, she's spitting. Women as universal dependents. Beverly Lindsay's conclusion in the book Comparative Perspectives of the Third World Woman, The Impact of Race, Sex and Class, says, dependency relationships based upon race, sex and class are being perpetuated through social, educational and economic institutions. These are the linkages amongst Third World women. Here as in other places, Lindsay implies that Third World women constitute an identifiable group purely on the basis of shared dependencies. If shared dependencies were all that was needed to bind us together, Third World women would be always seen as an apolitical group with no subject status. Instead, if anything, it's the common context of political struggles against class, race, gender, and imperialist hierarchies that constitute Third World women as a strategic group at this historical juncture. Lindsay states that the linguistic and cultural differences that exist between Vietnamese and Black American women, but both groups are victims of race, sex, and class. Again, Black and Vietnamese women are characterized by their victim status. Similarly, examine statements like, my analysis will start by stating that all African women are politically and economically dependent. This is a person who's never been to Africa or a country in Africa. Nevertheless, either overtly or covertly, prostitution is still the main, if not only, source of income for African women. That is a lie, I can tell you, even at that time. That's just factually wrong. It's agriculture. All African women are dependent. Prostitution is the only work option for African women as a group. Both statements are illustrative of generalizations through a publication, Women of Africa, Roots of Oppression, by a white woman, I'm guessing. Yeah, Italian writer Maria Rosa Cucciafelli, who's a Marxist and feminist. I wonder if in 1984 anyone would write a book entitled Women of Europe, Roots of Oppression. What is it about cultural others that make it so easy to analytically formulate them into homogeneous groupings with little regard for historical specificities? Again, I am not objecting to the use of groupings for descriptive purposes. Women from the continent of Africa can be described and characterized as women from Africa. It is when the category of women of Africa becomes a homogeneous sociological grouping characterized by common dependencies or strengths that problems arise. Descriptive gender differences are transformed into the division between men and women. Women are constituted as a group via dependency, via men who are implicitly held responsible for relationships. When women of Africa as a group, which is versus men of Africa, are seen as a group precisely because they're generally dependent and oppressed, the analysis of specific historical differences becomes impossible because reality is apparently structured by divisions, two exclusive and exhaustive groups, a victim and an oppressor. Here, the sociology is substituted for the biology in order to create a unity of women as a category of analysis. Cucciafelli denies any historical specificity to the location of women as subjects, as subordinate, powerful, marginal, central, or otherwise. vis-a-vis a particular social and power networks, where people fucking live and their realities, basically. Women are taken as a unified, powerless group prior to the analysis in question. Thus, it is merely a matter of specifying the context after the fact. Women are now placed in the context of the family, or in the workplace, or within religious networks, almost as if these systems exist as outside of the relations of women with other women and women with men. The problem with this analytical strategy is that it assumes men and women are constituted as sexual political subjects prior to their entry into the arena of social relations. Only if we subscribe to this as an assumption is it possible to undertake analysis which looks at kinship structures, colonialism, organizations of labor, etc., and their effects on women, who are already defined as a group apparently because of shared dependencies, but ultimately because of their gender. But women are produced through these relations as well as by being implicated in forming them. As Michelle Rosaldo states, women's place in human social life is not a direct sense of a product of the things she does, but the meaning of her activities acquired through concrete social and, I would argue, economic interactions. That women mother in a variety of societies is not as significant as the value attached to mothering in societies. The distinction between the act of mothering and the status attached to it is a very important one that needs to be made and analysed contextually. Oh, for God's sake. Bloody adverts.
Donkey.
Adopt a donkey. In Levi Strauss's theory of kinship structures as a system of the exchange of women, what is significant is that exchange itself is not constitutive of the subordination of women. Women are not subordinate because of the fact of exchange, but because of the modes of exchange instituted and the values attached to these modes. Oops. However, in discussing the marriage ritual of Bemda, a Zambian matrilocal matrilineal people, Cutrafeli in Women of Africa focuses on the fact of the material exchange of women before and after Western colonization, rather than the value attached within the particular context. This leads to her definition of Bemba women as a coherent group affected in a particular way by colonization. Here again, Bemba women are constructed as victims of the effects of Western colonization. Cutrafeli cites the marriage ritual of Bemba as a multi-stage event, whereby as a young man becomes incorporated into his wife's family, he takes up residence and gives his services in returns for food and maintenance. Damn right. This ritual extends over years, and the sexual relationship varies according to the degree of the girl's physical maturity. It is only after the girl undergoes an initiation ceremony at puberty that intercourse is sanctioned and the man acquires legal rights over the woman. This initiation ceremony is the most important act of consecration of women's reproductive power, so that the abduction of an uninitiated girl is of no consequence, whilst there is heavy penalties for the seduction of an initiated girl. Cutrafeli asserts that the effect of European colonization has changed this marriage system. Now the young man is entitled to take his wife away from her people in return for money. The implication is that women have lost the protection of tribal laws. However, whilst it is possible to see how the structure of traditional marriage contract offered women an amount of control, only an analysis of the political significance of the actual practice, which privileges an initiated girl over an uninitiated one, indicating a shift in female power relations as a result of the ceremony, can provide an accurate account of Bemba women, and whether they were indeed protected by tribal laws at all times. However, it's not possible to talk about Bemba women as a homogeneous group within the traditional marriage structure. Bemba women before the initiation are constituted within a different set of social relations compared to Bemba women after the initiation. To treat them as a unified group, characterized by the fact of their exchange between male kin, is to deny the social, historical, and cultural specificities of their existence, and the differential value attached to their exchange before and after their initiation. It is to treat the initiation ceremony as a ritual with no political implications or effects. It is also to assume that in merely describing the structure of the marriage contract, the situation of women is exposed. Women as a group are positioned within a structure, but there's no attempt made to trace the effects of marriage in constituting women with a changing network of power relationships, gender-based power relationships here. Women are assumed to be sexual political subjects prior to entry into kinship structures. And that is part 1. Part 2 will start very, very soon on this playlist.